Now that we've discussed the nature of organizational crisis, a few Public Relations Society of America tenets for crisis communication, as well as watched the Tylenol response to the 1980s cyanide crisis, let's talk about some guidelines that might be helpful to follow if an organization is in a contingent moment in which a response is required. So, a few guidelines to keep in mind. The first would be to remember the three A's. The three A's is a concept that I talk to my Communication 101 argument and advocacy students about. They essentially stand for analyzing your audience, anticipating their reactions, and adapting your message. So, anyone can arrive to a news conference. Journalists, members of the media need to identify themselves, but usually these are open to the community. If you know that the organization is in hot water from the perceptions of the community, then of course you'd want to make sure that your message speaks to your accountability and your plan of action moving forward. But always remember the three A's, no matter what rhetorical situation you're entering into. The next guideline is to get ahead of the media. So I remember during the Boston Marathon bombing several years ago, the police commissioner, Ed Davis, did a really good job of setting up 2-hour intervals between news media updates. So he would make sure that the media saw him as the central spokesperson from the efforts from the Boston Police Department, as well as all of the other emergency crews. That was a coordinated effort to make sure that he was the key spokesperson. He would provide an update, take a few questions for a few minutes, end that news conference, and then promise to return every 2 hours. At the time, there was a lot of uncertainty as to how extensive this terrorist attack would be, and so the 2-hour interval was a really helpful way to stay ahead of the media. Guideline 3, always prioritize victims and their families. In some instances, crises can verge on the political. Remember that these are real people whose lives may be forever affected, so erring on the side of the humane is going to be your best guideline when it comes to messaging during crisis. Guideline 4, know your crisis type. Now, the Seeger, Selinol, and Ulmer texts provide 4 unique crisis types, such as a faux pas, which is an external agent trying to develop a situation into a crisis, an accident, a transgression, which is an organizational member intentionally taking on an action that could cause others harm, and a terrorist incident. So if we're thinking about the crisis type, that can help frame our message. For example, if we know that our organizational member had been involved in a transgression, meaning taken on some type of action that could place others at harm, then a strategy such as mortification is particularly helpful for that crisis type. To mortify the individual or the organization means to claim responsibility and set forth a course of action. If the crisis type is an accident, then it's beneficial to talk about the reasoning as to why the accident may have occurred. We call that a justification strategy. Usually an accident happens in the course of normal operations, so we can talk through what that means. Of course, in a traffic accident, if you've ever traveled on Highway 81, for example, after Thanksgiving, there's bound to be an accident. It's just the nature of so many cars on the road. The faux pas asks the individual who's trying to develop a crisis out of a problem or out of just a situation to claim responsibility for doing that. So this was the situation with Elian Gonzalez, a Cuban boy who lost his family while trying to get to the United States, was shacking up with his relatives, and then, of course, the United States military came in to retrieve the boy. That was an unnecessary step. It wasn't a crisis scenario. The U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno had already settled this problem outside of the action, but the action was taken anyway. In this case, we'd have to hear about claiming responsibility for engaging into a faux pas. Terrorism takes on communication strategies such as ingratiation, meaning we're all in this together. I remember after September 11th, the United States ended up seemingly more united than it had been in quite some time, and certainly since then, because we were viewed as Americans and not just a combination of different identities. So an ingratiation strategy, one of suffering that says we're hurting right now, but we can resolve this with strength. So knowing your crisis type can help influence your message. Guideline 5, reflect the mission in the messaging. So in addition to knowing your crisis type, erring on the side of the humane, what does your mission say? And this takes us right back to Anthony Giddens. Of course, the Tylenol situation, Johnson & Johnson relied on its credo. Its credo said you place customers first. So that helped to initiate the nationwide recall. And the example we shared earlier at the University of Lynchburg, if we have a pillar of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then that pillar has to be resonant in the message response. So reflect the mission and the message. Guideline 6, avoid no comment. So most news conferences have a question and answer session with media or members of the community. If you're saying no comment, that indicates an uncooperative tone. Other alternatives might say, I am not at liberty to answer that question. However, I will check in with this department and come back to you at our next meeting. So we're trying to be cooperative with the media. The media can certainly be our allies as much as our adversaries. We see the media, we're taking an assertive approach to those questions, and that will allow us to work with the media. Question 7, avoid I don't know. In a similar vein to the no comment question, always think about how can I find the answer if I'm at liberty to share that information and disclose it to the media. And then, of course, the next announcement, going back to a guideline earlier, if we're meeting every 2 hours or whatever the interval might be, we can share that information with the media. Guideline 8, stay within your time frame. We know that news media are dependent on your remarks. Try your best to keep them clear, concise, consistent, and coherent. It's always a great idea to prepare yourself with another individual who might pose some questions that the media may ask. And then, of course, you have prepared responses to those questions. Keep it simple, keep it concise, but stay on point. End the planned media conference on time, and then, of course, return with updates as scheduled. Guideline 9, integrate your communication. The guideline tried and true beats shiny and new means that if you're trying to convey authenticity, then avoid the Twitter apology. That seems to be one of the common celebrity playbook moves. Anytime that there's a transgression, a celebrity tweets out an apology. Faceless, really without tone, without any type of authenticity. So holding the news conference, facing up to the media, the members of the community is best. We talked about interpersonal communication as the richest form of communication. But then, of course, once that message is sent, you can update your social media following the official statement. And 10, corrections. Always correct. Be sure to begin the next news media update with any corrections. If there was misinformation unintentionally shared online, then you can certainly use the all caps correction and at the start of your next blog or your next update, talk about that, clarify the misinformation. So those are the 10 guidelines as suggested by the Public Relations Society, as well as some information from the Seeger, Selnau, and Ulmer text. Thank you for tuning in. For the next topic, we are going to talk about the reflective communication plan assignment. Consider crisis communication perhaps in that assignment, but the assignment can go beyond that to really any communication challenge that you might have faced and how you might plan to overcome in the future.